Okay, now we're ready. So please welcome Adam Back, Marty Mommy, and Professor Matsuo.
Good morning, everyone. So it's my pleasure to have this keynote conversation here with Adam Back and Marty Mommy. And so I feel huge pressure to make this conversation success. But anyway, let's get started. And before that, I don't think that so we need to introduce Adam Back again. But anyway, so we can start with a very brief introduction of both of you first. So Adam, can you start your brief self-introduction to everyone?
Historically I was an applied cryptographer. I had a PhD at Exeter University. And around that time, I was interested in cryptography, and one of the topics then was export, which is what these T-shirts are about that Matsuo kindly printed. Which this piece of software which I wrote is an implementation of RSA, and it was not legal to export it from the US. And there was a law professor in the US who actually applied for permission to export it from the established US agency, and they said, no, you can't export it. So then, of course, we had a lot of fun printing it on T-shirts in Europe and saying, well, haha, you guys can't export this. So it was a fun part of the export control history. So anyway, I was one of the people on the Cypherpunks who were interested in cryptography, electronic cash, and spent most of my career on applied cryptography projects.
Thank you very much. And Marty?
Yeah, so I'm a bit from the younger generation. I was born in 1988, so I was probably playing video games at the time those guys were doing cryptography. I remember hearing the story of crypto wars from my dad, though, when I was a kid. My involvement with movement was a bit later, 2009, when I found Bitcoin and contacted Mr. Satoshi Nakamoto and helped him with the project for a while, contributing code and maintaining the website and the community. And now I'm working on my Nostr client, Iris.
Thank you very much. And before starting the discussion, so I would like to ask one question to audience. So yesterday I asked everyone to watch, illegally uploaded to YouTube that NHK special in 1997 to explain about that old cypherpunk, so what all cypherpunks did in late 90s. And so I would ask that one question. So please raise your hand. So you completed your homework last night. Okay. 20%, something like that. So, okay, I think that some of you already know about that. So what happened in the late 90s? But I would ask Adam to revisit what the cypherpunk did in late 90s from the beginning for the eCash system. But anyway, so let us. So this is some kind of education to audience. So please explain what cypherpunks is or what they did.
Yeah, so cypherpunks were interested in bringing the same kind of privacy rights you would have in the physical world with paper cash, having a private conversation in person, to the online world, because the internet technology would tend to, just by its architecture and by technological accident, allow some quite hierarchical logging and identification of people to their IP address or their web browsing and things like this. So a number of people thought this was, potentially a unintended and bad thing for society. So they wanted to turn it around. And there's a few ways you can deal with that. One is to lobby politicians and regulators for for the rules in the physical world to be applied in the digital world in a balanced and fair way, which isn't always the case. And the other way is to just build technology so that people can claim their rights without asking anybody, without any permission. So the cypherpunks were programmers, coders, cryptographers, and so they figured, well, let's just build the technology, people will adopt it, and then the regulators can catch up later. It doesn't matter, kind of thing. So that's what they did. And one of the piece of technology that got me interested to find out where other people were talking about this kind of thing was the release of PGP, like an encrypted email program by Phil Zimmermann. And so it was just a very interesting shift in potentially the balance of power between establishment and law enforcement and national intelligence agencies and governments that would like to, potentially censor media and the individual, because if you could send an encrypted email using public key cryptography, which PGP enabled and made easy to do, then nobody else could decrypt it. And that was something that the governments of the time were already not that happy about losing a bit of control just because the internet was very freewheeling and open. And so when Phil Zimmermann added this encryption, he actually was legally attacked by the US government for exporting PGP software. And that was eventually resolved, but one of the the cypherpunks were actually interested in deploying encryption software and privacy software, so they also implemented remailers, a way to have privacy for email, and later things like Tor, so things that eventually became Tors, or privacy for browsing. And so the battle with regulators about the export controls was really an incidental thing, a bit of friction that was the law enforcement in the US and a couple of other countries they would prefer that encryption didn't exist in commercial use, and so they couldn't do that because of US rule, like generally rule of law. But what they did is an indirect thing, which is they made it difficult to export cryptography that was secure. And so, of course, all that happened is people developed the software outside the US, and eventually they dropped those regulations. But that's where the shirt connects to the story.
Thank you very much. So yesterday I gave a talk about that because I started my work in 1996. It's before the end of the export control. I had a work to create a VPN from Japan to United States. So we have two offices in East Coast and West Coast United States. So we need to use different types of encryption, encryption product to exchange that different key lengths encryption mechanisms. That is a headache for us. But export control was at the end in 2000. So I think that it's a great win of the cypherpunks. Is that good? Is that correct?
Well, I mean, we thought we won, but then years later, Snowden showed that actually the establishment didn't give up, and they, coerced companies into backdooring things so that they could decrypt them even though they didn't have the keys. So that was a kind of later development. I think the other thing the cypherpunks were very interested in was electronic cash, but that was more technically difficult. But there was one deployed electronic cash system in the mid-90s, which was DigiCash by David Chaum, who's a quite well-known academic cryptographer, but he left academia and started a company to build this software. He moved to the Netherlands and operated that. And has extremely good privacy, this protocol, but it's centralized, so it requires somebody to operate a central database, and unfortunately that company didn't it ran into financial difficulty, and so the database went offline. And then if you had any of these coins, you couldn't convince anybody else they were valid, that they weren't spent, and so that was kind of the end of that. So the failure of that architecture caused a lot of people who were interested in electronic cash to think about what lesson you should draw from that. Basically, what went wrong? How would you design an electronic cash system that wouldn't have that failure?
Okay, and that is the architecture failure. But I would like to ask you to explain a little bit more about that. That is technologically good. So this protocol is good by Stefan Browns, but Stefan Browns and David Chaum. They're good, but so why? So the people didn't use that kind of protocol.
Well, I mean, I think there were enthusiastic users of it who thought it was extremely cool, but the other aspect of it is today we would call it a stablecoin because the only way to put money into it would be to do a wire transfer. And so because they were taking a more business approach rather than a cypherpunk approach, cypherpunk approach is you just build it and people use it, and then when there are millions of people using it, the regulators have to catch up, rather than the business approach of building it in a company and asking for permission, looking for service. So one of the problems that DigiCash had was working with banks so that they could receive the wire transfers. But actually, they were able to work with banks. So the real problem was actually just making money doing it and having sufficient funding. But anyway, I mean, I think after that, people thought that the solution would have to involve decentralization. And so I think Nick Szabo wrote about, building a decentralized database, Weidai did, and then the other challenge was how to bring new coins into the system. And coincidentally, around this time, like sort of mid 90s, late 90s, I was operating one of these remailers, which is the privacy technology thing I mentioned, and people were spamming through it. And so the challenge usually with spam, what people would do is block the sender's IP address, block the email address, things like that. But because this is a remailer, by design, you don't know and can't know who the sender is, so you can't block them. And so they'd spam through it. And so it caused me to try and find a technical solution, which was some kind of digital postage. So not electronic cash, because nobody'd worked out how to deploy distributed electronic cash, but a postage stamp where you would use CPU time on your computer, maybe a few minutes, and it would make a small hex string that you would put in the email header, and the recipient could verify that the sender had spent some time on it, and that would sort of be a cost and a friction. So it wouldn't deliver, a respendable value to the recipient, but it would create a cost for the sender and therefore slow down spam. And so when I released this software and discussing it on a Cypherpunks list, it seemed to occur to lots of people at the same time that this was a kind of digital scarcity or digital gold and might be usable as a way to have a decentralized way to create coins. And so, the early electronic cash proposals, B-Money by Weidai and BitGold by Nick Szabo, which were kind of ideas in 1998, by a year later, were all using Hashcash as their kind of design. Okay, we're going to do proof of work to mine the coins, and then some sort of outline architecture of how the transactions would be broadcast and there would be servers, but there were sort of design gaps in these protocols, so they weren't fully implementable. And I think one of the big challenges is there was no way to control inflation. So people might, they could download some software and use it to print money, so they would go crazy and print lots of money. So I think people kind of got stuck on that point until Satoshi came later and solved it.
Okay, in my understanding that, the original cypherpunk movement before 2000 is for that use of, democratization of the use of cryptography for everyone. And as you say, so some of them created eCash protocol, but they are centralized. So the invention of the proof of works or consensus algorithm of Bitcoin, so fully decentralized that protocol is. It's a huge jump from that centralized cash and decentralized cash, and I don't think that it happened in 1 day or 2 days. So it should be that the result of the years of discussion among cypherpunks. It's a good. I'm not sure it's a good question, but that kind of discussion. When you start that kind of discussion, decentralization of this cash protocol.
I mean, it might have even become before. I mean. Aaron van Weerdem, who wrote a book about Bitcoin history, went and researched and looked at all the related posts on the mailing lists. So that discussion about, well, we have to find a way to decentralize it, might actually have come before Hashcash. I think Hashcash kind of filled in a piece of this existing discussion. So, I mean, the overall thing from people talking about this after DigiCash kind of financially failed was probably 15 years before Satoshi, presented the extra solutions that solved some of the problems. But, there were people talking about it for probably a decade on and off, right? Like Hal Finney implemented something else related called RPAL, reusable proof of work, in 2004, for example. So people were still actively, to the cypherpunks, the deploying electronic cash system was the holy grail, like the prize, the best and most important, interesting technical solution to try and solve. They had a way to do privacy for email, encrypted files, anonymity, privacy for email and browsing, but they still hadn't found a way to do electronic cash. So they were quite, dedicated to try and find a solution, if you like. So yeah, I mean, Hal Finney was somebody who was always writing code and actually implemented that RPAL, but it was also centralized, unfortunately. So wasn't really like commercially usable, but it was an interesting step forward.
I'm very curious about that. That communication with Hal Finney or other guys conducted over email only, or do you have some in-person meetings or to discuss about it?
No, it's all online. I mean, I was living in the UK at the time, and he was somewhere in the US, and some of the cypherpunks were in the Bay Area, but I think some of them were. So it was really an online discussion mostly because it's, a niche technical area of interest, and so the people are where they are, so not all in the same place.
And I'm a cryptographer, and I'm doing many academic research. And for cryptography, peer review by academic community is most important, because to assure that there is no backdoor in the protocol specification. But surprisingly, Satoshi's white paper on that kind of preliminary discussion doesn't pass that kind of academic peer review process.
Yeah, I mean, I was somebody also doing kind of applied cryptography and had some published papers on distributed systems, so I'm familiar with what you mean, which is that within cryptography there's kind of two branches of it. One is the academic branch, where people try to prove the security of a protocol. They submit it to an academic publication review process to see if their paper makes sense and is reasonable. And a lot of papers don't get published, basically, so it's a kind of quality bar. And then on the applied side, people are really thinking about building an internet protocol, and they're often not going to write a paper. They're going to write an internet RFC if you're lucky, and if it's like a peer-to-peer client or something, there might be a web page with some documentation. And but a lot of things get broken when people don't take review, even in applied systems. So in any case, Satoshi just did some of these more applied things. So he just published a paper and released some source code. But fortunately, the way that Bitcoin uses cryptography is relatively conservative. Like, it wasn't using high risk or bleeding edge things. It was using standard signature algorithm, hashing algorithm, and things like that. So of course, there are still ways to make mistakes, and there were a few minor mistakes in his code that got fixed by kind of more applied or academic cryptography people later.
Okay, and it's good time to ask Marty to jump in that discussion, because you have experiences to have a conversation with Satoshi in the early day of the Bitcoin's development. So my first question to you is, so what is your communication with Satoshi looks like for the technology on the discussion, and so how do you communicate with him to develop something?
Yeah, so it took me like maybe 1 week to think about the Bitcoin white paper. I had seen all these other alternative monies out there, but they were basically just websites run by some third party and not real even eCash solutions or anything decentralized. So I sent the email to Satoshi I recently published the whole email history with Satoshi earlier this year. It's maybe like 200 emails, a very long discussion. Can be interesting to read, maybe. We talked, basically it was just matter of fact, technical discussion. We never talked anything personal. It was a very good discussion in my opinion.
But so what is your, so can I double click your communication with Satoshi? So what is your main subject of the communication with him, or so what is your contribution to that process?
Yeah, so first he asked me to write an FAQ for Bitcoin. So I did some like website stuff, set up bitcoin.org and forums and such. Later, there's a lot of maybe not so interesting discussion about configuration of forum software and website software and such. And then later, I also contributed to the code. We were thinking how to get more people to run Bitcoin. Like I did stuff like auto start Bitcoin software when your computer starts, and you could run it in the system tray, so it's a tray icon down there. He also asked me to run a Bitcoin node, so people would always have someone to connect to. It was a small network back then. There might be like 5 users or less online. So I kept my Bitcoin node running. I checked the box generate coins. Back then you could generate like 200 Bitcoins per day on your laptop or even more. So I left it running, and I think I ended up mining like 55,000 Bitcoins over the years. Unfortunately, I sold the most of it too early, but can't really complain.
Okay, thank you very much. With that, so I would like to talk about the non-financial, communication, decentralization of that communication. So with Matti, but before that, so before closing that the early stage of that decentralized digital cash development history. So I would like to that the main subject of this panel is the decentralization of the money or decentralization of communication, and so this is, I think that this is not a good question. This might be not a good question, but so do you think that the decentralization of the digital cash protocol is successful enough, or so we still have some research challenge to make that Bitcoin protocol better?
Well, I mean, I think when Bitcoin was released, it was an applied project, not an academic project, and of course, originally it became more decentralized over time as it got more users, of course, right? And as with many projects, as companies grow around it, they build applications that become a bit centralized, or mining originally was on computers and then graphics cards and then ASICs, and then you have companies with warehouses full of ASICs and they get a bit centralized. But it's surprising how well the incentives and the decentralization have scaled with the growth, So originally there really wasn't even a market or a price, and then so maybe more of a hobby kind of vibe, and I wasn't like involved in mining or running nodes and things back, when Marty was. So, but in any case, as it became more valuable, there becomes an economic incentive to run a node to do the mining, and so it's quite interesting that the game theory, which incentivizes people to secure the network, seems to have scaled from when Bitcoin was $1 or something up to a huge multiple of that, with a massive IT spend, and even governments, we heard yesterday, mining Bitcoin. So it seems the game theory holds at different scales, and so I think it's still decentralized enough because people have a competition in their economic activity, so they're not all behaving in the same way. So that's what you need now. I think the other thing about Bitcoin, for at least people like Matsui, myself, who were familiar with the kind of more cryptographic electronic cash protocols is there was a long history of these papers with incremental improvements, and there was a concept of basically what the idealized properties of an electronic cash system should be in terms of divisibility, privacy, and provable security, unlinkability, all these kind of properties, and Bitcoin didn't have many of them, shall we say. So I think originally the academics were a bit skeptical about this, and also the security margin was much lower. So in public key cryptography, the person doing the signatures of the encryption has a massive advantage, an asymmetric advantage versus the person attacking it, because the person attacking it has to spend billions of years of compute time in an almost unimaginable computation to forge a signature or something. And so the DigiCash and the Chorm and the other brands, there are many such papers. They assume that a central server is trusted, which is not a good assumption actually in hindsight. But if you make that assumption, then they have this huge security advantage, and Bitcoin doesn't have it. But the Bitcoin's security model is, well, the people that want to attack it and the people that want to secure it just have a hash war. They can attack each other economically on the network by doing competing things, and somebody's trying to cheat the system and somebody's trying to mine the system. And so I think it was a bit shocking to academic cryptographers that there was no advantage for the defender versus the attacker. But in practice, it's much harder to. There's not really a clear solution to have a decentralized system that preserves the simple security model. So it is what it is, and Bitcoin is decentralized. And it turns out that decentralization is more important than the asymmetric security. So after a few years, some academics published some systematization of knowledge, kind of sort of more mathematical, formal description of the Bitcoin protocol, because the Bitcoin protocol doesn't come really with a specification or explanation of the protocol in cryptographic terms, right? It's in the source code. So they came to respect it afterwards, I would say. But for myself, because I'm more of an applied person, it's more natural that internet protocols are implemented, or IETF protocols have less academic specifications, but still I could see that it didn't have as much privacy. So actually that was the first thing I actively got involved with in 2013, was trying to improve the cryptographic privacy, which and my protocol for doing that later became confidential transactions, which is available on Liquid, which is a layer 2 that my company makes. And so my original hope was to add that to Bitcoin, and maybe it will come one day.
Thank you very much. That's a good suggestion for the way forward. And I would like to just switch to the next part. On that, we discuss about that, the old cypherpunk on that, so democratization of the use of cryptography to everyone. Then we discuss about the decentralization of the money protocol, and then so we would like to discuss about the decentralization of the messaging protocol and the communication protocol, what Nostr is doing now. So I would like to pass my microphone to you to explain that what is a failure of the current messaging system or its governance.
Yeah, so our social media, I guess it's a similar problem to centralized money problems. Like we have all these Facebooks and Twitters deciding who gets to say what, and they are the only party that can verify the origin of the message, and they do the whole networking thing and everything. But now we have this Nostr protocol, which is very similar to Bitcoin in the way that user accounts are just key pairs, and people can independently verify the origin of the message. You form a social graph, and you can verify that. You could send the messages by whatever means of communication. Typically it's WebSockets on Nostr, but you could send Nostr messages over fax or pigeons or whatever means of communication, and be independently verifying those.
Okay, and I think that it's a not fun thing, but for messaging protocol, recently recent years, many governments want to prohibit the end-to-end encryption for messaging. That is a not good thing. But so I think that this is the other headache for us to use the messaging protocol freely. But what do you think about that? Then someone would like to control that end-to-end encryption messaging protocol.
Yeah, I mean, I think basically it's impossible to put the genie back in the box in the sense that there are so many protocols, open source and commercial applications that have end-to-end instant message encryption, end-to-end voice over IP encryption, like secure disk encryption. It's been this way for 20 years, more than 20 years. So, I think the problem is that law enforcement are working on a job for society, which is to deal with some unfortunate, like negative aspects of society that are, less than 1% of what's relevant. But they're immersed in their job, so they see the negative things and they want their job to be easier. But society is saying, it's more important to society that, we have freedom of speech, that people have respect for their rights. And so we're not going to make it your job easier. That's just the trade-off society chooses. But nevertheless, periodically, they're going to raise their hand and say, oh, encryption makes our job harder. Can we please change it? And then, people say no. So they do this every 5 years or something. So it seems like, unfortunately, they're doing it yet again, but it seems just so unrealistic that you could, persuade people to stop using encryption when it's available in, every operating system, in libraries, in protocols, and, you can't unpublish that knowledge, and it's much easier with software. The first voice over IP encrypted call was complicated because maybe the phones didn't support applications, or you didn't have open phone architecture to do it. But at this point, there's so much open technology and protocols and more programmable and cheaper devices and faster networks that I think it's impractical. But they do cause a problem because sometimes they manage to get a regulation through, and then there'll be a side effect, and then there'll be a court case, somebody will be a test case, and then they'll roll it back. Or, some country will have a bad policy and people will build software in other countries and things like that. So it's just a kind of ongoing tussle, I guess.
Okay, that's a good point. So for the points, so Adam mentioned now is, for the messaging platform. So what do people want to the messaging protocol to realize that the lies to say anything over the messaging protocol? What do you think about that? So what do people want to that messaging platform?
Well, I mean, I think when Elon Musk took over Twitter and released internal information about how they were collaborating with the government, and not even for law enforcement, just for biased political views to do with the management of the company's, political party preference, to interfere with a democratic election, I think people were pretty outraged about this situation, and it shows that it's not, it's not even about law enforcement. It's just kind of interference in the democratic process, which should be clearly, illegal in any country that pretends to be a democracy, right? So I think that caused people to think much more heavily about how to avoid that. So of course Elon Musk was motivated to try and fix it in a centralized way, and he clearly improved the degree of free speech and less interference with what people are saying. But I think people with a more cypherpunk approach figured, well, let's build decentralized chat applications so that this can't happen, and that's where Nostr comes in to take a technological approach.
Yeah, and even if you're not ideological, there's the pragmatic case to be made that messaging is critical infrastructure of our day, and it's not a good idea to just centralize it to one company where someone can just make a mistake and someone's accounts get blocked at a critical time. I think that's what happened in Japan maybe last year. Some famous people were banned by algorithms from maybe X and other platforms, and then they were seeking alternatives. I think Mastodon was one of the popular alternatives at the time, and Nostr also got a boost. We have a great and surprisingly active Nostr community here in Japan.
Okay, how, it's some kind of trade-off, but as for decentralized community, like as a Bitcoin core community or Nostr community, so the sustainability of the community is most important things to consider, because that it's not easy to maintain that. So incentive mechanisms to maintain the community big enough. But so my question to that to the Nostr community is how large the Nostr community is now, and so how do you try to maintain or increase the number of people involved in the Nostr community?
Yeah, so Nostr is not super large right now. I think it's like 50,000 active users at the time, but it's growing organically, and the fundamentals are on our side, just like with Bitcoin. So I believe Nostr is really the future. Network effects are, of course, always difficult to overcome. So it would help to, if we could somehow integrate Nostr more with existing platforms. You can import your social network from existing platforms. You could do hopefully cross-posting, like the same posts go to all the platforms.
So is Bitcoin or Lightning Network payment is a source of the incentive mechanism for Nostr platform?
Yeah, so Nostr is really popular in the Bitcoin community, and basically all the Nostr clients are integrating Bitcoin payments and tips in some way. So you can tip posts by Lightning, and that's often an eye-opener for people. I'm just about to release a new version of Iris, which gives you a wallet right away. It's an eCash wallet, by the way. So you don't need to configure anything. You just type in your name, press go. You have a Nostr account and a wallet. People can start tipping you in Lightning, and it can be quite an experience for people who are used to filling in all the information when making transactions.
Yeah, interestingly, the electronic cash protocol that Marty mentioned it's called Cashew, and it's another kind of Bitcoin layer 2, but its architecture is actually almost identical to the original DigiCash protocol from the mid-90s, maybe with a bit more modern cryptography, but the idea is the same, the blinding-based electronic cash, but this one is connected to Bitcoin, so the way you put money into it is you make a Lightning payment that gets held by a centralized eCash server, and it gives you coins, and then you can transact the coins using the server. So as Marty's saying, the Iris wallet has a Cashew client embedded in it, and then a way to move in and out of Bitcoin, but it's still Bitcoin denominated balance in Cashew. So now we have Chorm style central server electronic cash, but I think the point is that for larger amounts you can use the main chain. For interoperability you can use Lightning, but for low values you can use this centralized thing. So there's more risk of losing the money, but ultimately for small amounts and tipping it doesn't matter, and you can take it out if you want to anytime.
I think that okay, go ahead.
Yeah, and it's interesting. You can even send those eCash transactions offline. If you trust the other party to not double spend, you can do it offline, or maybe only the sender recipient can be online while the sender is offline, and you send the money by a QR code.
Anyways, I think that the layer 2 technology is a key to implement that, because that the number of messages are very huge than the number of the Bitcoin transaction. So this is the reason why I think that some special or existing or special layer 2 protocol should be integrated to that Nostr platform. Is that correct? Because that the number of messages is very huge.
Are you talking about Nostr or?
Yeah, in Nostr, yeah.
Yeah. So on Nostr, we've recently have had a wave of spam. So there's like these bots that reply to every message with just replicating the message and even doing a fake profile of the poster and sending that to everywhere they can. So I feel like someone's testing the system and forcing us to change. And many clients, Iris included, have implemented Web of Trust, which is an old cypherpunk idea that they had in PGP already. So basically we are using our social graph, our follows list, so you can filter all the incoming content by the author. So you might want to accept only the messages from the people you follow and maybe their follows, and maybe even third-degree follows. Then you can also use mute lists, like people have muted these users. They don't want to see their content for one reason or another, but that's totally optional. So there's no censorship. Everyone can decide what they want to see.
Yeah, that is a good idea to prevent spam messages without revealing that content itself.
Yeah. Yeah, so I basically think Web of Trust is the only viable way. Of course, you can do like IP-based filtering to some extent, but you can always get new IP addresses and get around it. I guess that can make it a bit more difficult for someone unconnected or someone who wants to stay anonymous and not get introduced by their real name to the network. But in that case, I think you can use lightning payments. You can tip people on Nostr to get noticed even if you're an unconnected user.
It's based on that, so integrating Bitcoin or Lightning network, so we can inject some financial incentive mechanism as well as so we can equip that some non-financial reputation or incentive mechanism to make that Nostr ecosystem healthy.
Yeah. And the Lightning or the Bitcoin money integration is something that Nostr has that no other social media really has. And I don't think Twitter is, as a corporation, is ever going to be able to do something like that. Even though they have plans to add payments as well, but there's all the compliance and regulation stuff making things more difficult for them.
And for this part, so my final question to Matti is, so we discussed about that, failure or headache for the centralized messaging platform, but the Nostr will solve everything or as part of that. Adam said that, so why we need a decentralized messaging platform?
Why we need decentralized messaging?
Yeah.
Well, there's I joined Bitcoin because I had like ideological convictions. I'm quite passionate about liberty. I share the cypherpunk ethos. You're not free if you need to ask for permission. You just write code and change the world. So that's one point. We need decentralization because we don't want to give too much power, like political power, to any single entity. Then there's infrastructure concerns. Then I guess it's just fun. Nostr is really fun, and you can really feel the freedom aspect of it.
Okay. Some idea?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, I think companies tend to want to control things so they can make money from them, or maybe make money from the switching cost. I think, as Marty said, it's difficult to bootstrap a new social media network because there's a sort of network effect. But it's growing, and people value, particularly given the last few years of disclosures about how politically censored and interfered with the social media platforms were. People have now a way to avoid that risk, and so there's an incentive. I think the other kind of more technical effect is that it's technically more difficult to make a decentralized system than a centralized system. Like the cryptography is harder, scalability is harder, the architecture is more complicated. You have to deal with peer-to-peer networks, which are less reliable. You know, the nodes in the network can leave at any time, so it makes it more challenging. But you know, in some cases, it can become more scalable because you've got more nodes. So, you know, my PhD was in distributed systems. So, with some kinds of protocols, if it's perfectly parallelizable, you know, if you've got 100 nodes, you might be able to get 100 times more throughput. But in a lot of cases, it's not perfectly parallelizable, and then scalability becomes challenging. And that's true for the Bitcoin blockchain because it has to have global consensus. And so it's actually quite hard to scale Bitcoin. But I think the Nostr, because it's a different use case, doesn't need consensus. It can take a more relaxed view. It can use sharding more easily and use other scalability mechanisms. But, you know, I think as it scales, you know, 50,000, 5 million users, etc., they will probably incrementally improve the architecture to handle that amount of traffic on, you know, volunteer or independent nodes by different companies and things like that. And sometimes decentralization doesn't have to be like very large. It just has to be enough that if one server or one service misbehaves and does something that people don't like, they can just immediately switch. So no switching costs means that it keeps service providers honest, let's say.
Okay, and it's time to wrap up this session. We have 3 minutes left. And I would like to ask that final question to both of you. And you know, one of my friends in Japan, so Professor Jumrai, he is the father of the internet in Japan. And he is a maximalist for the end-to-end communication for the internet. So he doesn't like that, you know, client-server communication like HTTP. He doesn't allow that kind of thing. But at the same time, he said that, you know, without client server, you know, so web, you know, HTTP system without client server, so the internet will not that deploy to everyone. So it's some kind of trade-off. But you know, yeah, you know, you know, we know that so huge benefit of the decentralization of the communication of data cache, but at the same time that it's not easy to create a point of profit for the sustainability for the ecosystem for the fully decentralized something. So what is the next step to keep that the benefit of the decentralization, but deployed to everyone?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, Junrei is talking about like the internet architecture for websites, and you have like Web 1, Web 2, Web 3, right? So with, I guess, the early web, people were hosting their own web servers, and so there was no kind of blogging app that was a centralized company that could censor your blog or take it down. It was your web server. You could put what you wanted on it, right? So I think as long as it has that kind of architecture where people can host things and there's competition, then you also benefit from the Streisand effect, which is, you know, if somebody does something that's viewed as bad or a node gets shut down, then there's 10 more. And if you shut those down, there's 100 more. So it becomes kind of, you know, the network reacts. I think Andreas Antonopoulos in the Bitcoin terms was describing this as anti-fragility, which is if you attack the system, it becomes more robust. And typically that's by the reaction of users because they have enough control to add infrastructure themselves. And if they're motivated and there's millions of them, it becomes almost impossible to stop them. Like with the earlier peer-to-peer file sharing applications, you can't really stop a million people who want to do something, or a society that feels it's entitled to do something and doesn't, you know, and the regulators then have to catch up rather than being able to do anything about it.
On the same question to Marty. Marty, so it's the same question that, so how do you know, improve that Nostr ecosystem without losing that benefit from decentralization?
How to keep Nostr decentralized.
So if you would like to increase the number of the Nostr community and giving sustainability, So you need to do something, but without losing that benefit from the decentralization of the messaging protocol.
Yeah, so I think fundamentally Nostr is just about the public key-based accounts and content-addressed messages, like hash-addressed messages, which are independently verifiable. You can always change the network afterwards, and you don't. It's not like Bitcoin where you need consensus rules. So you can always experiment with different networks and topologies. So I think we can make it. We can do peer-to-peer, like BitTorrent scales very nicely, and there can be large servers. You can run your home server to serve your friends and so on. I think we will make it.
Thank you very much. At the end of this session, so I would like to thank to all both legend of this protocol development, and thank you very much for joining today. And so let's thank to that both speakers.